Thanks a lot for inviting me, and also Marit, that I could come to Perth with another project. Actually, this seminar is going to be about something completely different. It's more related to my PhD research I finished in 2014. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my PhD research, which was on solar cooking, the adoption of solar cooking, but I'm also going to introduce at the same time a methodology you might have heard about. I don't know how familiar you are with it, called Qualitative Comparative Analysis. And I thought it's a nice way of combining these two subjects because it makes it much more practical to understand QCA. I must also say that it's always a challenge for me to explain QCA because you normally have a 2 to 3 weeks course of QCA because it's so big. So I do hope I could narrow it down and that it's understandable, but just ask me afterwards if something is unclear, because I have done that several times with students at NTNU, and it was a bit tricky. But these were also social science students who are afraid of numbers, so yeah, more from the qualitative part. But anyway, I just thought to start by a very short also introduction, since I'm here, on where I actually come from which institution, because several people have approached me and were interested in some collaboration as well, and so I always think it's good that I mention this as well. So I come from Ruralis. I'm a senior researcher there. Ruralis is an independent research foundation. It's called the Institute for Rural and Regional Research. We closely collaborate with the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. You probably have heard about NTNU. We are a very small research institute, 28 researchers with a background in social sciences. But we are still very proud that we exist and we haven't merged, because a lot of the other research institutions in Norway, they have merged nowadays. They are huge. We closely collaborate with NTNU because we are also located at the campus there. And we do mainly research on rural sociology. For example, we have research related to the transition towards the bioeconomy, because Norway wants to leave, doesn't want to be dependent on the oil anymore. We have a lot of projects related to climate change in agriculture, local food production, organic food. We have a mix of, yeah, a lot of different people. And we also have more and more international research cooperation now, yeah, with Australia, with New Zealand, Canada, and also the UK. So just to have a really short background. And I wanted also to make some quick advertisement. We're going to host a really big conference of the European Society for Rural Sociology. Here's the link to it. I guess I can circulate also the presentation afterwards. If anyone is interested, it's next year. We're really hard working on it because for such a small research institution, it's really a big thing. Some years ago, we also hosted the World Congress, which is approximately the same size. Okay, now I will come to the topic itself, actually. I published in my PhD several papers and also my PhD thesis on the adoption of solar cookers. And what I'm going to talk about today is mainly based on my thesis and one conference paper I published where I used QCA. The other papers are a bit different. I don't use QCA. I use qualitative research, but not really the methodology as such. Just a little bit of a background, because I don't know how much you have heard about solar cooking. In developing countries, it's very common to prepare food by using firewood, especially in rural areas, which is very inefficient. It can lead to deforestation and also health issues, because it's often an open fire and you breathe in all the smoke, especially if it's inside also a place. And it's also very costly for people. So an idea here is to use the sunlight. So it's not like solar panels where you convert it to electricity. It's that you use the heat directly for cooking. And it's really not a new idea. Solar cookers have been there for a really, really long time. And they have partly a very bad reputation because in many places they didn't succeed. And there have been, when I started, I wrote my master thesis already about solar cooking. There were a lot of academic contributions related to the technical aspects, how to improve the technology as such, but without looking at the social background, at the people, at the cultural factors in the area. And also, most of the cookers have focused on the individual level, at the household level. That's what I did in my master thesis. But the institutional focus has been ignored. So I wanted to take this up in in my PhD thesis, and I also collaborated with an engineering project at NTNU where they tried to develop a new institutional solar cooker with heat storage. So my work was in a way very much related to this technical work to give guidance on the development of this technology. So the overall question in my research was to identify the determining factors that would lead to the successful adoption of solar cookers. And I compared a certain type of solar cooker called the Scheffler reflectors in different countries. So it was very important for me to compare one certain technology, so to make a real comparison. I would come back to the Scheffler reflector, what they are, how they look like later on. The Scheffler reflector can be used at direct kitchens, what you saw on the picture before, that you can make use of the sunlight directly for heating, but you can also make it for producing steam. That's very relevant in India, where you do a lot of steam cooking of rice, for example. So I had both of these types in my study. And I defined the institutional level when you cook for more than 15 people per day. So these are the Scheffler reflectors. As you can see, they are huge. It's a huge reflector, and in comparison to the solar cookers I showed you before, this technology has the focal point of the parabola is outside of the parabola, which makes it possible to actually cook inside a house, which is really important, because that was one of the main limitations of the small solar cookers, that people have actually to stand in the sun. And you can imagine, you know, in Australia, how hot it can be when there is a lot of sun. No one wants to cook. You normally want to be in the shade. So there's already the first thing where you think, okay, maybe it's a bit tricky. So the idea here was, okay, I actually don't need to be outside, because now it actually reflects down here, which could be some aluminum foil or aluminum sheet, and then it reflects the heat up. And also he developed a tracking system based on a kind of bicycle clock that the reflector would always track into the right way because of the sun. So you wouldn't have to do this manually anymore. This is how it looks like in real. This is from Burkina Faso. Here you can see already that the focal point here is not correctly adjusted. That's one of the challenges with this kind of mirror as well. Well, I can tell plenty of stories why it didn't work, but I want to go mainly focus on the study variables. And this is from India. This is how it can look from inside. Here they were baking chapati. So down here you would have this kind of aluminum sheet, and it would heat it up. So it's actually a very practical, for institutions, a very practical invention. And then you can have it at a really large scale as well. In India, you have it on temples where they cook food for thousands of people. And here you can see it's connected to the steam pipes. You have a receiver here where the sunlight is reflected, and then it heats up the steam pipes. So it's a complete different setting here. Here you can see one of the temples in India where you have this on the roof. You can imagine when you have it on the roof, it's also much more secure because of theft, that no one can easily access it. And these are the kitchens. And this temple here, I think this is from Shirdi. This temple is open 24 hours. So this just to the background. So my interest was to find out what makes institutions continuously use this technology and why in some places isn't it used. So what are the factors behind it? And in order to analyze this, I decided to use QCA. With QCA, you have to remember that QCA has a very particular conception of causality, which is based on multiply conjunctural causation, which means you don't assume that only one variable can lead to a certain outcome, but it can be a combination of different variables, and you can have different combinations of variables leading to the same outcome. I will come back with an example for my study later on. It's no problem if it's a bit unclear now. Also, it's very different to standard quantitative research, statistical research, because it's nonlinear, it's non-additive, non-probabilistic, and it rejects any form of constant causality. So QCA combines from the qualitative research the very case in-depth research, but it also uses variables, which very much comes from the quantitative research. And it stresses equifinality, which means, this is a bit what I just said, that I could have it gives me a formula, an equation in the end with different variables, and says, okay, the combination of these variables leads, for example, to the successful adoption. But there might be another combination of variables, and it can also lead to the same outcome, and that's the equifinality in this case. But it's also, of course, because since it rejects any form of constant causality, it can just also produce modest generalizations, which is in a way a limitation as well. The choices, and here comes the qualitative, the cases, and here comes the qualitative aspects, they are very much informed by theory. You have to choose your cases really carefully. For example, in my case, I had to think about, I had much more cases than I originally put into the study, but then I had to make some decisions on the way. Why do I take up these cases in my study or not? And it's very useful for small intermediate N designs, something from 10 to 40 cases, but nowadays it's much more used also in large N designs, and it's combined also with statistics. But I haven't worked with that. As I said, for me, I actually had to read about it now again because I haven't used it in a while. So, but just that you get a bit of the concept. It can be used to just summarize data, of course, in a more concrete way. It can check the coherence of the data. What we call contradictory configurations in the QCA language means that if I have, for example, an equation with different variables that say, okay, these variables lead to this outcome, but I might have another case where I have exactly the same variables not leading to the outcome. That would be a contradictory configuration, and then I need to figure out why this is there. I can test hypotheses and theories with it, but I can also generate new insights. So I have this inductive-deductive approach here. Well, it's mainly based on the logic of Boolean algebra and set relations. I don't go into set relations now because this is an entire lecture on its own, so I'm really trying just to get the main aspects now. There are different forms of QCA. The most standard one I used in my PhD thesis is called crisp set QCA, which uses binary variables. So, for example, I would identify the successful adoption as 1, and then the unsuccessful I would define as 0. What the Boolean minimization means here is that I might have a lot of different variables that I think lead to this outcome, but I want to reduce it to a shorter one. In the QCA language, when I use it gives me an equation in the end. I will show you just an example equation in some minutes. Plus in the equation means or, a star means and. Capital letters always means that the variable is present. If the variable is written in capital letters, it's present. If it's in the lowercase, or, I forgot how you call this one, in this sign, it's absent. Here, for example, I would have the variable r, and the variable b, and the variable I, or the variable r and the variable b, without the presence of the variable I, would lead to the certain outcome. So this is what we mean with multiple conjunctural causation. I have multiple variables, and I have multiple paths. I have one path here, another path here, both leading to the same outcome. But what we see here is as well that I doesn't seem to play a role, because in both cases it leads to the same when it's present and absent with the same combination. That's what Boolean algebra does. It reduces, it helps you. This is just this very simple example now, how to reduce the variables. Very important also in QCA what it does. If you want to, for example, in my case, when I want to know what are the determining factors, it helps me to identify something they call the necessary or sufficient conditions. Conditions is the same as variables. It's just another term. You can call it like this. So a necessary condition is a condition that is always present when the outcome is present. It cannot be there when the outcome is not present. So in our example here, we would have B would be a necessary condition. I always call it, it's like the fuel for the car. Without the fuel, you cannot drive your car. So it needs to be present. But it doesn't mean that the fuel on its own can drive the car. But you need to have it there. A sufficient condition would be a combination. It can be a condition or a combination of conditions that always occurs when the outcome occurs. But it can also occur when the outcome doesn't occur. So this is very much the difference between the two. So you can have the outcome without having this sufficient condition, but it can be there as well. This is different to the necessary, where it always has to be there. And here, I don't want to go into this. I just wrote it on the slides. Here is where we come into the set relations, why there are different set relations. Because in this case, the outcome is a subset of the cause, while in the other, the cause is a subset of the outcome. So it's a very different relation. But even if it's not really clear now, it's just I wanted to give you the terms. So back to my study, what did I do? In the end, I had more than this, but I had to drop some of them because I had some problems to get sufficient information on some of the variables in some of the cases. I had issues also with the reliability of the data, that things were told me that were not true because I could see that it's not true. So these were all the issues with the qualitative research. So in the end, I chose 24 institutions in 4 different countries, in Burkina Faso, Botswana, South Africa, and India. And they all showed different levels of use. So I went to these countries and I interviewed the institutions, mainly the managers, but also the cooks at these institutions. And then I identified the successful adoption as 1, and the not successful. It's unsuccessful, but again, I cannot call it unsuccessful because of the logic of QCA. I can only say which is really bad English, but that's according to the logic, not successful. But I don't want to explain that now why it's like this. I define successful adoption as the continuous use for at least 1 year, because that's something that was neglected in the past, that it was said, look, we have implemented all these solar cookers, but then after a year, you went back and you could see they were not in use anymore. So 1 year was also because then people had to go once through the rainy season, and that was actually one point in the literature, that after this, normally people didn't go back to the solar cookers. In the end, I had much more, but that was via theory and everything what I told you need in QCA. I was left with 8 variables that I operationalized in form of interview questions and dichotomized based on the QCA logic. And then you get something like this after your data collection. So here I have my different institutions where solar cookers were applied. And here I have my different variables. I don't think I have the time to go through all the variables, but for example, this one here means food characteristic, which means does the food prepared with a solar cooker taste the same as it tastes prepared with firewood? Because that was something I identified from the literature, which was seen as a problem. Same with schedule. Schedule means the schedule of daily routine. Can I actually cook food with a solar cooker at the time when I want to eat? Or does it prepare food in the afternoon, but I eat in the evening? So environmental motivation was also really important, and economic motivation. Do I want to save maybe money with it? Based on the interviews, I coded the data, and then also here are the results. 1 is it's successfully adopted, 0 it's not. Well, very obvious when you run the first analysis, economic motivation was a necessary and sufficient condition, because in all cases where it was accepted, economic motivation was present. And in all cases where it was not adopted, it was not present. But I didn't want to say, okay, this is my main conclusion now for my PhD thesis, that you need to have economic motivation. So what you can do in QCA is you can run a 2-step QCA, where you divide into proximate and distant conditions. Remote or distant conditions are conditions that are very stable over time. And here I realized when I read about it, I have a lot of these variables in my study, because for example, cooking habits is something that is normally very stable. People have been cooking in this way for a very long time. While you have proximate factors here that can be easily changed, and here we have the motivational aspects. In many places I saw that there was one director who said, yeah, let's go for the solar cooker, implemented it, but then there was a change in the leadership, and the new director wasn't interested, and then the system wasn't maintained, and the motivation went down. So to sum it up, after I ran also the 2-step QCA, my main equation I was left with was that food characteristics, if the food tastes the same, combined with that I can actually cook at the time I want to eat, combined with economic motivation and environmental motivation, which could be, for example, to help the environment, leads to the successful adoption. But what I didn't know before, but I realized during my fieldwork, the environmental motivation had a complete different aspect than I thought about before, because a lot of these institutions who use the solar cooker are located in India, and they are temples, and they have a certain religious thinking behind. And I used to stay at these temples, a kind of participatory research. I lived there. I followed the daily schedule, and I wanted to learn more about their way of thinking. And it was very interesting because they always told me that when they use the solar cooker, they feel like they connect with the spirits in a way, because they always also, they were praying to a light that was up in a corner. So light was very important for them. And if you think also about Hinduism, you don't want to harm anything outside there in nature. So what was told me during my stay there in all of these institutions was that it very much relates to their spiritual thinking, their worldview. And they liked that about solar cooking, that it was in a way a pure, a peaceful thing. In addition, of course, to the economic benefits, because if you think about these big institutions I showed you previously, where they had these solar cookers on the roof, they had a backup as well. They had a diesel generator, and every time they had enough sun, they could turn off the diesel generator and use the solar energy, and they could save a lot of money, but they had a backup in addition, which is also an important thing here. So that backup made it possible for them to actually cook at the times with the solar, always cook at the times they wanted to cook, which goes into the schedule of daily routine. And this is why QCA is such an, I find, interesting combination of quantitative and qualitative research, because it helps you to narrow down your data, but at the same time, this doesn't tell me anything. I need to have all the qualitative in-depth data behind. I need to know what is actually happening at these places, and which I got through the participatory approach behind there, in my case. It doesn't have to be like this, but I also ran the two-step for the unsuccessful cases, and here we could see that all of them shared the absence of economic motivation. And a main explanation here was what was frequently mentioned at these institutions is the change in management, which led to changes in the economic motivation, what I told you previously. So this is how it looked like in these places. What happened also over time when these systems were not under maintenance anymore, a lot of people in the area took the small mirrors home because they don't have mirrors, and they like to have them at home. This is another bakery. Many of these places, they were very old systems. When I came there, people didn't even know what I was talking about. And then I always pointed to because it was a new management again. And this is, I think, a really interesting thing. I just put it here. This was not part of the study, this one, but this is the peacock who always picks against and destroyed also the cooker, because they told me he had a girlfriend, but the girlfriend left him, and now he's alone and he's always picking. And this is where you can see that you cannot really control for everything when it's about technology development. So my main conclusion is that the organizational structures, what we could see with the economic motivations, are very important when you want to introduce solar cookers. You need to have local people in place who have a motivation behind it. It cannot be a top-down thing that in many cases someone came from outside, had a great idea, put the technology there and left. In many places, that's what I said with the schedule, where you had a heat storage, a backup, or a hybrid system. This one here is super heavy. This is an iron heat storage, which you can turn around and then you can make chapati. This is a really an important thing, that you can actually prepare food whenever. And that was my major inputs for the engineers at NTNU, that they should develop something that has a backup or that has a heat storage or is even a hybrid system. And then again, this is a poster from one of these organizations, Clean and Green. We should consider the worldview behind what is relevant for people in these areas. How do they think? What is their maybe spiritual beliefs? And see how can this be integrated into technology development. So if you want to learn more about QCA, if you want to take a look, I brought this book. This is a really good introductory book about QCA. The one you see there on the right, this is a more advanced book. I didn't bring it now. This is where you can read about the two-step QCA I used. You can read a lot about set relations. QCA is everything is open source. You can download the FSQCA software I used here. You can use also Tosmana software. I have used this one as well because it has some different applications that FSQCA doesn't have. There are also other softwares nowadays. And you can find a lot of information on compass.org. Very important that you write 3S, because if you write 2S, you end up at the religious website. And there you can get all information on courses. There is even a peer review on articles, because it's, I think now, I checked it some days ago, there are so many articles now out there. Because when I started it, it was very difficult to find reviewers who could actually review my paper, because they didn't know about the methodology. And people at Pia especially, I noticed people can become very critical, because I'm originally more a qualitative researcher, and when I presented this, for example, at our department, I suddenly was alone, because all the qualitative researchers said, no, 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 you cannot do this. And the quantitative, they were saying, no, no, this is no proper quantitative research. So you are a bit in this kind of middle position, and you don't really know what to do. But anyway, I hope I actually finished now. We have a lot of time left. I could give you a bit of an introduction, and you probably have some more questions. I also brought my PhD thesis, a copy. I don't know if I should leave it here or at the library or something, but if you want to take a look, you can read about QCA there as well. Thanks.